someday, and it's not going to be in 5 years, but 20, 30, 40 years from now, you buy a battery, you pay a couple of bucks as a deposit, you bring it back in. That battery, everything is recycled. The plastic, the lead. 50 years from now, no one's going to be talking about we're opening up more lithium mines. You won't need it anymore.
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everybody. I'm Scotty Greenwood with Canadian American Business Council, and I'm joined here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada by Professor Chris Sands of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Hey, Chris, good to see you in person, my friend.
Good to see you in person, Scotty, from the other side of the street.
That's right. And we're up here in Toronto at the Eurasia Group BMO US-Canada Summit. And
it's a mouthful.
It's a mouthful. But it's great to have this pop-up studio. And I'm excited about the conversation we're about to have because critical minerals, lithium, electric vehicle batteries are top of mind, not only in this conference, but in the president's visit to Canada and in our economy generally. So I'm excited about our guest, Chris, and maybe you could introduce him.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So Jonathan Evans is Director and President and CEO of Lithium Americas. He serves he's been more than 20 years in the operations and general management experience across businesses of various sizes and industry applications. Previously, he served as Vice President and General Manager for the Lithium Division of FMC Corporation in the U.S. and as Chief Operating Officer of Diversitech Corporation, a portfolio company of the private equity group Permira. John has also held executive management position roles at Arista Life Sciences and Amri Corporation and General Electric. So pretty distinguished corporate career. Thank you very much for joining us, John.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Scotty. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. And this podcast will air after the summit, but as we're recording it, it's right before you go on stage. So maybe give us a little preview of what your message is here today at the Canada-US Summit.
I think some of the speakers that started, whether it was Ian Bremmer or Premier Ford, really hit the nail on the head. I mean, we've had a lifetime opportunity here as you see industry, especially the automotive industry, transforming. And we have all the ingredients in the U.S. and Canada to do this. Actually, if we don't do this, it's our own choice. The critical minerals, the technology, the leading automotive manufacturers globally, we can be successful.
So let me ask the blonde questions, Chris. I usually do that. You ask the others. So tell us about lithium. What is it? What do you use it for? And what does your company do?
So lithium is, I like to say, the blood in the battery. So that's literally what it does. The ions move from one pole to the other in the battery, and the electrons, of course, fuels the circuit. So it's the critical ingredient to make all lithium-ion batteries work. Hence, lithium-ion batteries. It's has the highest energy density. It's the lightest metal. So by its virtue of where it sits in the periodic table, it's very difficult to replace, especially since we all lead these mobile lives with smartphones and laptop computers, and now, of course, electric vehicles and delivery trucks and everything else that's coming out. So it's a critical piece. Lithium is needed in that in a refined form. So it's different than iron ore or coal or other we'll call commodities. Once you take the material out of the ground, really the focus and really the main capital density of these projects or capital costs around the processing of it. What leaves the facility that we're building in Nevada is essentially a pharmaceutical grade product that can be put into a cathode in a battery. So it's complicated. I'm not a mining person. I'm actually a chemicals and materials person. And you can look at my background. I spent the bulk of my career in chemicals and specialty materials. The mining component of what we do is actually quite small. But with that, you need both. So I've heard lots of things. We should do processing here and so forth. It doesn't work. I'm old enough, I hate to say, to remember the Arab oil crisis and embargo, where we had lots of refining capacity between the U.S. and Canada. In the U.S., we didn't have enough crude oil. So if you don't feed those refineries, you don't have a product you can use at the end of the day. So you have to solve the problem holistically. Luckily, between the U.S. and Canada, we have.
And that's helpful. And your company in particular, so you both dig it out of the ground and you convert it into something that goes into manufacturing. You do both of those things.
Exactly.
And what's the footprint of the company, John?
We have the largest project that we have in North America is in Nevada, and then we have a joint venture and another greenfield project in Argentina. And we're actually in an agreement with a company that we partially own that's focused on lithium exploration and development in Western Ontario and in Manitoba.
Oh, interesting. Okay, Chris, I just have one more question, then I'll turn it to you. But sticking with my very basic questions, I flew here today from Washington, D.C. to Toronto, and one of the things that you have to declare when you're getting on a plane is that you're not going to put a lithium-ion battery in your checked baggage. And so why is that?
There's a lot of energy stored in them. If you go to a gigafactory or the gigafactory that Panasonic and Tesla has, you'll see the amount of expense and design that's gone into actually where they put the cell storage. There's a tremendous amount of energy that are stored in those batteries. So fire control and suppression, how they're handled, how they're actually individually packaged to make sure that there's not a chain reaction. You're literally holding a lot of energy in your hand with a recharged battery. So you have to be careful. There are different kinds of batteries that have a lower risk. You're hearing a lot about lithium iron phosphate or lithium iron manganese phosphate, which you're hearing a lot about it in Canada. And in the U.S., the deal with Ford, with Tesla potentially around this technology. I want to make sure the audience understands that technology actually came from the U.S. and Canada. It was patented and protected for years. Of course, it wasn't. The patent wasn't defended in China, so that technology actually was built on. So the tech that you're seeing from CATL and BYD actually started right here in this continent, as was the lithium-ion battery, which was developed at the University of Texas.
And that's an age-old story and something that we worry about, which is IP theft, intellectual property theft. And that's one of the things we worry about with China, because they do steal ideas and replicate them, right? I mean, I guess that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, I think Senator Manchin quoted that himself.
That's right. It's well known.
It's well known.
Yes.
Well, Scotty, you asked the blonde questions. I asked the gray questions. So I was going to ask you about pricing. You know, there is a commodity element here, and China in the past has flooded the market when they wanted to sink the prices and wreck projects, or been willing to withhold to make a political statement, famously 2011 over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands with Japan. How do we create the market conditions so that we can see this industry grow? Like a little bit of the stability piece. And I hate to ask this, but what's the role the governments have in Canada, the U.S. to kind of create those conditions if this is something that we want to see?
You don't hate to ask that.
Well, I do. But so I'm old enough to remember that industrial policy used to be a bad thing. And so I'm trying for those listeners who also have gray hair to say, okay, why is this necessary and where does it, I'm not going to pontificate. I want to hear what you have to say, John.
Well, I think firstly to understand that China doesn't have a lot of lithium resources. So that's part of the issue,
really?
Right? They're out
Okay.
shopping around the world, investing in projects early and bringing the material back to China to process. So you always hear about the processing piece. They are tapping their own lithium resources, but there's stories about that as well, which are true, that they're very low quality resources. There is a bit of a pricing floor with that I think actually we've reached now. That's been in the press, but I do know the math and I agree with that. So they're in the same situation as we are. We're actually in a better situation in that the U.S. and Canada are essentially untapped. We haven't explored very much in Canada, and there's lots of spodumene in Canada and the Canadian Shield. And there are deposits like the Thacker Pass project, which is a sedimentary deposit in the U.S., in the West. So we've chosen not to do it. We ceded the processing. And this all started with the offshoring of portable electronics. So the industry already started pretty much. They had the infrastructure there. And whether it's lithium or rare earths, a lot of those materials, Australia is the largest supplier to China for raw materials for lithium. So it's they have the same issues we do. They've just been much more overt about going after them because they have their own industrial policies, we very well know.
They have the Chinese.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now the U.S. has an industrial policy, which I applaud the administration. This is no different than the interstate highways projects in the U.S. or how the semiconductor was born, with collaboration with the U.S. government. It's important. The government has to send a message as to what they support for the business community, and the business community wants to help because at the end of the day, actually, this is what consumer wants. What's a good investment? It's good for all. Right. It helps preserve jobs. It helps preserve our national and economic security, energy independence, which we're seeing very much now with the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And thankfully, it was a warmer than expected winter in Europe. Whereas who supplied a lot of that oil and gas? It was the U.S. and Canada.
Right.
So,
I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about, a little more about where you find lithium. And in particular, I've heard recently, Chris and I do some work with the province of Alberta, and they have all kinds of resources. Canada is blessed with many, many resources of all kinds. So in Saskatchewan, we think about uranium, and in Alberta, we typically think about oil and gas, but they have these saline aquifers that have lithium floating. Is that right? Like, are you involved in that, or what's your assessment of that opportunity?
So there's three big classifications. You have hard rock, which is more traditional mining, where the lithium is contained in a certain form and a traditional like hard rock type of operation. You have brine-based deposits. These are called continental brines, or oil field brines. These exist actually in the U.S. as well. It's called the Smackover Formation, which is in Arkansas and in that region of the U.S. There's actually a company down there working on that. So yes, it exists. And then you have sedimentary deposits, which is the type we have in Nevada, which is sediment because it was left over of an ancient volcanic caldera, and there's about a kilometer deep, thick layer of very rich lithium-containing ore that sits at the surface or right below. So it's almost, I hate to use the analogy of oil and gas, but you have different types of deposits, whether it's on land and sort of low cost for Saudi Arabia, whether it's deep water offshore.
Or tight shale.
Yeah. You have all these different variations with the same material. It's just how you recover them is different. Actually, how you process them is very similar, because what you're trying to do once you process it is to essentially remove all the impurities and get to a pure form, and a form such that it can be put into a battery. So yes, Canada has many resources, and I'll say North America has many resources.
Well, we're going to take a little break. And when we come back, I know Chris has some more questions to ask. And I want to talk a little bit more about public policy. And if you could design the world of public policy, what would you have the policymakers do? So we'll be right back.
The Wilson Center's Canada Institute is a proud co-producer of the Canusa Street podcast. For more insights and analysis from the world's leading think tank on Canada-U.S. relations, please visit us on the web at www.wilsoncenter.org.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everyone. I'm Christopher Sands, and I'm here with Scotty Greenwood, and our guest today is Jonathan Evans from Lithium America. Scotty, we're just about to ask him a question about policy.
Public policy. So I'm learning a lot about where you find lithium and how you develop it and why it's important in our daily life and in our strategic competition in the world. I wanted to ask you, and Chris started to ask you this, I want to dig into it more. If you could design the ideal public policy for the industry and for your business, what would it look in Canada, the United States? What would it look like? Or is it already there?
I think a lot of the steps are coming together now. The U.S. has an industrial policy of which critical minerals is a part, along with batteries, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors. Canada has some of the same elements which are coming together from the Canadian government, and they focus on whether it be permitting and the permitting process itself. Whereas I don't think...
Are you good with the permitting process? Because if you are, you're the only CEO I've met that isn't frustrated with the pace.
We're fully permitted. So
you're good.
Yes. And of course, the U.S. is very typical. Every project's appealed. We went through appeal process.
How long did it take?
The whole process together took about 4 years.
Okay.
And it took about 7 to 10 years before that to prepare for permitting. So it's a very lengthy process. We talk about lithium deposits. There's many. The cost to develop those is different. And then you have that whole roadmap of how you get it permitted. So there's the formal piece of permitting. There is the community engagement piece, which is oft not talked about. I think it is by the NGOs, but that's actually part of the permitting process, but one that I think both companies and the government alike support, and is often not talked about the good things that are brought with projects like this,
right?
And the strong permitting regulations which are already in place. I don't think I know nobody's asking for environmental regulations to be loosened. They shouldn't. To your earlier point, what the frustration is that the process is unpredictable. And
the permitting process.
Yeah. In terms of when you get answers back. When you order something and it says expected delivery is X,
right?
It might be off by a day or a week or whatever else, but you have some, pretty much when you're going to get it. Where permitting is, you don't have that. It's sort of open, and it's difficult to attract private capital when people don't understand what when they're going to get a payback. What's the time value of money? The government has stepped in the U.S., and they're doing the same now in Canada to help buttress that a little bit, whether it be low-cost loans for the Department of Energy, or in Canada you have EDC, or grants that are coming out now to help companies like that company in Alberta, who I know quite well, or my own company, who's tapping the U.S. Treasury and Department of Energy to help with a low-cost loan, because private capital, they don't want to get involved because there's been horror stories. You have projects that are in permitting for 10 years between the formal permitting and then it's in the U.S., the appeals process is unregulated. So,
well, and once you get through that, you might face litigation because we know how litigious the United States is.
You go through an appeal to an appeal. It depends who the judge is. Can more plaintiffs join? Actually, that it's kind of hard to say you're not aware of something that's been through a permitting process for 3 or 4 years, and now more plaintiffs want to join. It has to have some boundaries around it where it's a predictable process, and I think that's where permitting reform really needs to go. And that, look, after 2 years, the answer is yes or no. And if it's no, this is what you need to do. Come back when you have it done, versus stringing out forever. And there's no predictability at all on. I actually, and I'll say this, even though I'm taking advantage of it, the government shouldn't have to pay for this. This is you have, how many people are here? Hundreds of people. I was at the SAFE conference last week. There was hundreds of people. You go to these industry conferences, there's thousands of people. People want to invest in this. People want to work in this sector. They see this is where the world's going. It's like an aversion of tech. So there's money that's there, but people are unsure if they don't understand any predictability on permitting. It's like, wow, this is going to take forever. My money's dead here for a while, so let's find something else. So they wait. And that's where governments step in to help accelerate that.
Well, and we were at the SAVE conference together, what used to be known as Securing America's Future Energy. And it was a terrific conference in Washington. From minerals to markets was the theme. And Senator Manchin was pretty adamant about permitting reform and the battle he's having with the White House and members of his party, the other party, about how to get there. So,
interesting dichotomy.
Let's see how it works.
Canada has the same as the U.S. You have Western Canada and you have Eastern Canada. Same thing in the U.S. Western Canada, Western U.S., people make their living through living off the land, essentially, natural resources. Timber, coal, oil, mining, agriculture, exactly, cattle, and in the East we don't do that supposedly anymore. But we have the benefits all here because we don't really think about where our stuff comes from, and a lot of our fellow countrymen, that's how they make their living. The western part of Canada and the U.S. isn't all a national park.
Right.
People have to make a living. So you see that in Congress in the U.S. Senator Manchin's from a natural resource state, obviously. And it's a bigger issue. It's just not mining or minerals processing. It's pipelines, windmills, hydro projects. They're all wrapped up in the same process where put critical minerals as part of infrastructure for North America. Look at the pipeline battles in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
Government
Well, look at, sorry, Chris, I keep pointing to Chris to say take over, and then I keep jumping in. But just on that point, while President Biden was in Ottawa 2 weeks ago, the U.S. are urging Canada to move faster on all of these kinds of projects. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers saw fit to delay a tunnel project in the Straits of Mackinac for Enbridge, which is delivering oil and gas to a whole region of the U.S. and Canada, and has a project to make it safer, and yet they're delayed by another 2 years. So I think that was coincidental. Left hand and right hand not really coordinating, but yeah, we see it all over the map with any big project, right, Chris?
Absolutely. Well, and I wanted to follow up on that because I think a lot of the people who have a sincere concern about the environment and so on don't appreciate, but with the processing, the handling of lithium and some of these other important critical minerals and rare earths, you have to be very careful because you don't want a negative environmental impact. And I don't know the industry as well as you do, and you have a chemistry and materials background. But when we look at China, when we look at other places where these minerals are produced and processed, we look at the Democratic Republic of Congo and so on, we're about as conscientious as you can be in terms of this. And I don't think it's appreciated that it's probably more cost, but we try to do it right. And it's important because if we don't do it, we'll be buying from people who are destroying the planet on the other side of the world. Right. Is that too strong?
No, it's right. Very much, and I think Robbie Diamond said this week, there's a bit of see no evil, hear no evil. Yeah. I don't want to know where this stuff comes from, although I'll complain about it. we can do it better here. We have very, very high standards here at our own project. If you sort of add in things that were needed to be done, or I want to get ahead of where I think regulations might come from, it's over $400 million of capital costs, whether that be emissions control, whether it be lining for a waste rock area that technically isn't required, but it's better to be safe than sorry in the future. Recycling of water. We recycle over 85% of the water we use. Each drop is used more than 7 times.
Really?
All of these things up front, you design that in the project. There's a cost to it at the end of the day. But to your point, we have higher standards here. Standards aren't the same across the world. Even permitting. Some countries you can come in and you want to build a project and it's eminent domain. You're going to move tomorrow. We're building an airport here. That doesn't happen in North America. We live in a democracy here and people are free to speak and there's a process for that. Same with appeals. You don't hear about appeals in some of the countries that you listed off. You don't hear anything.
Right.
It's part of a national mandate in those countries. I think we have a national or international mandate, I should say, between the U.S. and Canada as well. But you have to have both groups willing to sit down and be constructive, as opposed to my position is going to be, I don't want this no matter what. In the case of lithium, you're not going to have 50 operations around the U.S. and Canada in the next 10 years. It costs billions and billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. There's all the process that you have to go through with permitting. There's a limit how much the government can handle at one particular time. I think I've quoted this number before. If we have 6 or 8 of these projects by 2030 in North America, we're doing pretty well. And I think the thing to forget...
How many do we have now?
1. There's 1 in Nevada. That's
yours?
No, that's one that's been operating. The only one that's been operating continuous since early 60s is for Albemarle.
Okay.
There was a mine that's reopened again in Ontario now that's just started to produce. It was one that started, and now it's shuttered, and then it started again. And there's a third that they're looking to push into operation over the next 2 or 3 years. It's peanuts.
Yeah.
It's nothing. Very, very difficult.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and it's in a technical area I don't know a lot about. If you were speaking to our listeners, Canadians and Americans, and trying to leave a message with them from being on the industry side, what do people need to know about the Canada-US relationship, about the production of lithium and the goals that we have? Is there anything that you sort of flag that we need to be more educated about here?
Well, firstly, I would drop the defeatism. It's too late. We can't do this. We're actually blessed on this continent with the natural resources and actually the technology already to be successful. I think I said in the beginning, if we choose not to do this, that's our own decision. It's not because we don't have the resources to do it. It's not going to happen tomorrow. So the policies that are putting in place, that the U.S. government, the Canadian government putting in place, folks, we're not going fast enough. Well, some of the largest infrastructure projects that we enjoy today took years and years and years. 10 years from now, it's going to look a lot different. And that's how our governments work. It's turning a ship in the harbor. It takes actually over multiple administrations, but we get to where we need to go. We live in big countries, and you can't turn in a dime, but you have to start somewhere, and we've started. And I think another thing is that with the manufacturers, we all are neighbors with everybody. I live here as well. People are committed to doing the right thing. I gave you a couple of examples of extra or above and beyond things that are integrated. People look at what happened 50 or even 20 years ago. A lot of regulations have changed. I use the example all the time of, I remember cars when there was no airbags and no shoulder belts and so forth. You can't build a car like that today. You can't build an operation like we have today because it's essentially illegal. So the standards are much higher. And I think the other piece, and I pulled that into it early, you're not going to have a whole bunch of these. And at some point, you won't need them anymore because unlike oil and gas, these are recyclable.
Right.
Someday, and it's not going to be in 5 years, we don't have enough batteries, it won't even be in 10 years, but 20, 30, 40 years from now, we don't mine a lot of lead anymore. You buy a battery, you pay a couple of bucks as a deposit, you bring it back in. That battery, everything is recycled. The plastic, the lead, it's going to be the same here. 50 years from now, no one's going to be talking about we're opening up more lithium mines. You won't need it anymore.
That's amazing. And I love to end on that note because it's not about cradle to grave in manufacturing. It's about a circular economy. And that's something that's an important concept. I'm glad you left that with us, and also a sense of optimism because it's good to hear that too. President Biden talked about Canada and the United States are about possibility, and I think you're seizing the possibility here in North America. So anyway, thank you for joining us, and we will see you on stage downstairs in just a little bit.
Thank you.
Chris, how cool is it to have a conversation here in Toronto with an American running a Canadian company with an essential critical mineral in the United States and in North America? I think it was a terrific learning experience.
It was amazing. And what was great about Jonathan Evans is that he talked to us about chemistry, material science, that very technical side in language I think everyone on Canusa Street can really grasp, that this is a historic opportunity for both countries, and the private sector is leading, which is a good story.
Well, and as we heard last week in Washington from diplomats from around the world, particularly Australia and Chile, what the United States has done in terms of its investments with the Inflation Reduction Act and the semiconductor, the CHIPS bill, and also infrastructure, it's changed the arithmetic. So the U.S. government is putting a historic amount of money into this clean energy transition. And so companies like John's are really availing themselves of that. And that's meaningful.
I think it is, absolutely. And I was joking about industrial policy, but what's really interesting about what's happening in Canada and the U.S. is they're avoiding the biggest risk of industrial policy, which is that government picks winners and doesn't always pick them well, and you end up spending a lot of money and wasting it. What they've done is create an incentive structure that allows the private sector to do what it does. And the market would solve this problem eventually on demand, but what we want is to move that deadline forward to get it done quicker. And so by not favoring one company or creating a national lithium company in the United States or Canada, we're getting a good result through very smart investment and leadership by the government.
Well, and Chris, I always hesitate to disagree with you, especially, and on this one, but the market, and as a business counsel, it's crazy for me to say this, but the market really would not solve this critical minerals issue, in my opinion, because the market cannot compete with non-market economies like China. And that is the reason you have this government intervention, because China, as you said, floods the market when it wants to, depresses prices of these commodities. And also, as we know, and people should Google this. If you don't know about this, Google what's happening in China with critical minerals, because there are literally toxic rivers. There are people whose lives have been lost in this very challenging environment. And so we do it right here in North America, but that's expensive, and government is now stepping up.
I think that's really important. Both sides of Canusa Street are free markets with governments that are trying to get us where we need to go. It's a great story.
It's public-private collaboration, hopefully at its best, and hopefully at the pace of what we need to have progress. So we shall see.
Absolutely. Well, we'll see, and we'll follow this very closely from here on Canusa Street.
Sounds good. See you, my friend.
See you soon.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.